everyone, and good on you for working on this Easter Monday. As you will have seen, the latest fuel stocks update is out, and that shows we continue to have a normal flow of fuel, with petrol at 62 days, up 3 days from the last update, diesel down slightly, just less than a day, at 52 days, and jet fuel up 4 days to 50 days. We continue to hear from fuel importers that they are experiencing no material issues with future shipments, which means we have the confidence to stay in phase 1 of our fuel response plan. So while we have no concerns about the current flow of fuel into New Zealand, we do remain gravely concerned with the trajectory of the conflict in the Middle East. We continue to call on all parties to show restraint and to endeavour towards a negotiated outcome. It's simply the case that the longer this conflict goes on, the more harm there is to civilians and those in the Middle East, and the more harm there is to the global economy and to New Zealanders here at home who have already experienced sharp increases in their prices for fuel, and I'm sure that's been very unwelcome for many families this Easter. I'll take your questions.
In terms of the amount of ships coming into New Zealand, that's been something that commentators have been talking about, and that worry about that April 20 date. Are we seeing a normal amount of ships coming in, or is it declining?
Yes, we are continuing to see a normal flow of ships in, both from refineries in Southeast Asia and then into our exclusive economic zone. We're continuing to work very closely with fuel importers on a daily basis to check with them whether they're seeing any disruption to orders they already have or to future orders. They continue to report that ships are leaving normally, that orders are being fulfilled, and that they're not having challenges currently placing orders. Regardless, we are preparing for an unwelcome scenario in which future orders could be cancelled or there could be challenges, and that's why we've put the fuel response plan in place, and it's why we moved quickly last week to secure additional storage at Marsden Point and to work with commercial players to see if we can get more fuel into New Zealand to provide us a greater buffer.
There's also some pretty extraordinary scenes in petrol stations around the country where diesel has gone above 95, which is quite a big deal for a lot of people and also for costs around the country. What happens then, and what happens if it keeps rising way ahead of fuel prices?
Look, diesel has been the fuel most affected in this conflict. It's up more than 90% in New Zealand, so that's extraordinary. I'm not surprised. Some New Zealanders are experiencing real sticker shock because we're used to, when we go to the petrol station, seeing diesel cheaper than 91, and it's now the reverse. What that reflects is that diesel internationally is a fuel that isn't that flexible in demand, even in tough times. People continue to use it, and so you've seen the price rise rapidly internationally. I'm advised that the price rises we're experiencing in New Zealand are in line with what we're seeing in international markets, but I know that that's having a big impact on diesel users and is very unwelcome. Again, the sooner this conflict ends, the better it is, not only for the people of the Middle East, but certainly New Zealanders at home who I know can ill afford diesel at the prices it currently is.
Obviously, this only goes up to last Wednesday, so it won't factor in Easter weekend, but is there anything you've heard as anecdotally from fuel companies about New Zealanders' usage over Easter, like have they been changing habits or have they been stocking up more?
Look, I've heard a range of different anecdotes, so not enough that I've got data to put to at this point. What we have seen in terms of the data that the fuel importers have been sharing with us is some evidence that there was a big increase in demand in part of March, and then it's calmed down since then, consistent with what I think we saw, people stocking up potentially, and then moving to use public transport, to carpool, to reduce their fuel use. In terms of what people have seen over Easter, I'm sure it is the case that some families have unfortunately put off road trips, chosen to stay close to home because of the price of fuel. And I will be looking at that data as soon as we have it to understand how this Easter looks compared to last Easter. One of the areas that the fuel importing companies have agreed to cooperate with us more closely on in future is sharing that demand data, because obviously if we were to move to a phase 2, we'd want to know whether any restraint measures were having material impact. So having that data and monitoring it is going to be very useful for our work going forward.
Is the government confident that those ships that are carrying international orders will actually reach New Zealand?
Yes, we haven't had any reports of those ships being turned around, and we've told fuel importers to let us know as soon as they have any signs of that happening, because that would be a trigger for an assessment under our fuel plan. They haven't reported that. They've also reported that once fuel is in the ship and the ship has left port, it's highly unlikely for it to turn around. The challenging point is when the ship is in port waiting to be filled, and that could be when you might see a cancellation of contract. Again, we haven't seen that yet, but the reason we are preparing is for that potential eventuality.
And just on diesel, a lot of motorists that I've spoken to who operate diesel vehicles are kind of complaining about having the likes of road user charges and now soaring diesel prices. Would there be any government consideration to help within the likes of diesel-specific users?
Yeah, well, both petrol users and diesel users pay road tax to help maintain and build roads. In the case of petrol users, that's part of the price they pay at the pump. In the case of diesel users, they pay it as a road user charge. So actually they each equally contribute to the roads. It's not something that diesel users are expected to contribute more to, nor would we expect them to. The challenge with any temporary pause in either the petrol tax or the road user charge is what happens when you have to put it back on again. It's an extremely expensive measure. Even just for 3 months would cost around $500 million, I'm advised, and we know that it is a very difficult thing to ever put back on. So at this point we have chosen targeted relief measures focused on those families with low incomes having to support children working each day. And that targeted relief is intended to help them, but we are very, very conscious that these high prices are affecting just about every New Zealander, every New Zealand business, every New Zealand firm, and we do expect that that impact will have a run-on effect to inflation more broadly, because we are starting to see already businesses having to put on surcharges, increasing the prices that they charge in order to recover that fuel cost. So look, it's very, very challenging. But in the end, what this reflects is a global spike in the price of oil, massive disruption to global energy markets, and we call once again for the quick cessation of this conflict. We call for de-escalation. We call for the upholding of humanitarian law.
Of those days you were quoting, how many days are outside the economic zone on those ships?
So in terms of petrol, 32 days of that is outside the economic zone. In terms of diesel, 26 days, and in terms of jet fuel, 23 days. So what you can see is there's a component that is always in country or in our sovereign waters. That's required by law in New Zealand. We have a minimum stockholding obligation, and in order for fuel importers to meet that legal requirement, the fuel needs to either be in the country in storage tanks or in our sovereign waters. So those are healthy amounts of fuel that are on the way from elsewhere, consistent with what we would expect to see.
What assurances do you have that they won't be diverted, these ships, to other countries?
Well, the assurance we've had is from fuel importing companies who report they haven't had any of the people they purchase from indicating that that is a likely occurrence. These are long-standing customer relationships that they have with these businesses, and those businesses are seeking to be reliable. However, it is the case that we are anticipating there could be a scenario where those refinery companies are no longer able to fulfil orders, and they declare what's called force majeure. They cancel a contract at short notice. It's preparing for that potential eventuality that has prompted us to put the fuel response plan in place, and it's why we are taking rapid measures to get increased amounts of fuel into the country so that we have more of a buffer should that occur.
Has any further policy work been done on potentially deferring the excise rise coming in January, or not increasing it by as much? I think it was a week and a half ago, Transport Minister said he would probably have more to say on this soon. Has there been any further work on that?
It just seems very unlikely in the context of what's happening with global oil prices that we will be increasing the excise tax next year. That's not something that is very likely to occur at all. There's no formal decision that we have made yet as a Cabinet, but in order for that to happen we would have to legislate, and there has been no proposals for legislation brought forward at this stage.
Have officials been providing any advice on
Look, officials are clear that in the absence of increasing fuel tax, of course, we would have less revenue for road maintenance and construction, but we're just very conscious that the cost of living for New Zealanders is such that they can ill afford an increase in petrol tax and road user charges at this time, and it's something that ministers would be reluctant to progress, and it's not something that we have taken additional steps towards.
Is there a specific deadline, though, by which you would need to legislate?
Well, the petrol tax increase was set to occur from the 1st of January, so that would require legislation this year.
In terms of the, I know you've been getting a lot of advice from Treasury about what this could do to inflation. There has been talk that they've provided numbers that is above 7 as the top end of scenarios. Is that correct?
Well, look, what Treasury have done is they've put together different scenarios for what could happen with the oil price and how high it would go and how long global energy markets would be disrupted. They've not yet formed a view of what that means for forecasts. Forecasts won't be finalised until later this month, feeding into the budget, and we'll publish the forecasts at that time.
In terms of what New Zealanders should be prepared for, in terms of what the potential numbers could be, I mean, 7 isn't out of this world, is it, in this type of situation?
Well, look, it's already tough for Kiwis. I think they can see right now that their costs have gone up on a weekly basis because of the soaring price of fuel, and we are very conscious of it. And I've always been straight with New Zealanders, which is that it's not just petrol that will go up. Unfortunately, what we see is that when petrol and diesel go up in cost, that has implications for prices across the economy, everything from freight through to your groceries. And so we can expect that inflation will go higher. How much higher it goes really depends on how long this conflict lasts and how long it is until the Strait of Hormuz is open. And again, if I could get the Strait of Hormuz open tomorrow and stop this conflict tomorrow, I would, because that is the best thing I could possibly do for inflation in this economy. But unfortunately, that does not lie within my power.
Have you also had any sort of more deeper down advice around how much the price of diesel will affect food prices in New Zealand?
I haven't had a specific piece of analysis on that, but it is the case that diesel is both an input into the production of food, the harvesting of food, the planting of food, getting the milk in the tanker to the factory, so it has an impact there. But it's also a case that the finished product of food being moved from the farm to the supermarket also has a fuel component. And when we look at this conflict internationally, it's also had a big impact on the price of fertiliser, which will impact global food prices. They will tend to go up, and New Zealand, of course, does import quite a portion of our food, and so we'll be exposed to imported inflation in that way as well. So it is my expectation that this will have a negative impact on food prices, and I regret that hugely. Again, if we could just end the conflict, then those impacts would be ameliorated. This is a tough time for the country, and I'd like to say that there won't be additional inflation, but that would not be true.
With one of our triggers for an assessment being major changes in Australian policy, were you surprised last week that the Aussie PM made this big indication he was going to address the nation, and it was essentially sort of just, hey everyone, it's tough out there. It set off a bit of anxiety on both sides of the Tasman. Were you surprised that he did that?
Oh, look, I'll leave every Prime Minister internationally to choose how they communicate with their own people. The approach we've tried to take is one that is steady, that is clear, that gives you the facts, noting that this is having a huge impact on New Zealanders. When we have bad news, we will share it with you, and we have stuck to having that fuel response plan so everyone can be clear under what circumstances we would move to restrain demand for fuel, at what point we would ask people to minimise their fuel use. We're not at that stage yet, but we're not ruling it out in future.
How much further have you also got with the consultation for the different sectors within the phases 3 and 4 in your answer? So it might take a couple of weeks.
Yeah, look, there's been hundreds of engagements on that so far, hundreds of emails from affected businesses and sectors, but also formal engagement via the freight users group, via primary industry groups, via other groups. And so officials are collating all of that feedback to ensure that the final priority bands and the mechanism for prioritising fuel in phase 3 and 4 reflects that feedback. It's really difficult. No one wants to be in a situation where we would be restricting fuel use, which is why we're working so hard now to try and get additional fuel in to work on ways in which we could restrain demand at phase 2 to prevent us ever having to move to 3 or 4. But it is the case that in order to be prepared and prudent, we do need to do that engagement. So it's been progressing well, and we will in the next few weeks have further announcements about it.
Just take a couple more.
So have you spoken with any airlines, the likes of New Zealand recently, on jet fuel?
Look, the jet fuel stock, as you've seen in the latest update, continues to be at normal levels. We're doing very close engagement with the aviation sector on what an allocation model for jet fuel could look like in phases 3 and 4. So that engagement went into a lot of detail during the week. At this stage, as I say, they have sufficient jet fuel in the country, but again, we're looking forward and considering that there could be a phase where that's not the case.
Is heading over to the States now for meetings with officials over there. What are you expecting to come from those with the likes of the conflict and fuel?
Look, it's a very serious time for international affairs. The conflict in the Middle East is affecting the people of that region gravely. It's affecting the global economy in profound ways. I expect that they will discuss that conflict, its trajectory, and in particular that our Foreign Minister will share perspectives about how it's affecting our country, our people, our region, because it is the case that those effects are very negative, and it's important that the United States hear that perspective.
Can I just ask a question from Presto, colleague, on recent polling done by Roy Morgan, if you had seen it?
Honestly, I get so confused between all the different polls, Reid, Roy Morgan, all of these different ones. I couldn't tell one from the other.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.